Hi everybody, Screenside Chat number 2. Welcome back to the University of Pennsylvania. We're glad to have you with us where we're going to take this opportunity to amplify a few of the things that we've seen happening on the discussion boards, check in with you all for the second time during this class, and just see if we can share some of the thoughts we've had from some of the great stuff you all have brought to bear on the course. Wanted to start off with one or two comments on what's going to be happening for you all. Last week you were very busy, I know, writing your papers in addition to doing all the reading and the quizzes and all the other things that the course requires. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what's coming up this week with the peer review. You all are going to be engaged in a brand new kind of teaching and learning. You're going to be issuing evaluations of each other's essays. For some people, this causes anxiety. Listen, I can just tell you from my perspective, when I have to grade a paper, I'm anxious too. It is never the easiest thing in the world. Just follow the rubric such as it is up there. Do your level best. And we know that in addition to helping others learn, you yourselves becoming people who are assessing each other's work, you yourselves as assessors of each other's work are going to learn a lot too. That I think is going to be a helpful part of what the course is all about. The results we'll just have to work with. That's what we're doing in this experimental part of the class, and it takes effort from you all. We thank you in advance for realizing the importance of this in terms of the whole course. So you're remember, it's required for you to have completed this writing assignment to also do 5 different peer reviews of other essays out there. Another way of thinking about all this is you've got a blog post and you need to respond to other people's blog posts. This is not supposed to be informal in that way blog posts are. We've got formal essays written by people with very careful attention to detail. We expect also that the reviews will be very careful attention to detail. But this is part of what the give and take of what this large mass environment allows us to do, and we're going to experiment with it, and thanks very much for being a part of the experiment. So that's where we're going next. For right now, let's spend some time talking about this close of the Odyssey and some of the questions that have come up in the last couple of weeks on the discussion board. We worked on 1 through 8 in the first piece of what we talked about when we had our first Screenside Chat, and now the rest of the Odyssey and all the things that have been happening since then. So I thought I'd turn it over to our team. Maybe we could just go around the room or around the couch one more time and introduce each other once more. Peter Struck, you know me from some of the videos, and my team is here.
Hi everyone, I'm Caroline Whitbeck. I'm a PhD candidate at Penn in comparative literature.
Hi, my name is Carrie Mowbray, and I'm also here in the Classical Studies Department at the University of Pennsylvania.
And I'm Kat Gillespie, and I'm also received my PhD from Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm a lecturer here. And I think I get to start with one of our first questions, and this started really with our week 3 discussion on structuralism, one of our key tools for kind of examining the Odyssey. And there was obviously a number of different posts, a number of different threads on structuralism, trying to understand this very difficult theory. One of the threads was labeled Structuralism and the Wisdom of the Crowd. So Tony Fitzgerald started this thread, and he proposed some of these different sorts of oppositions that we see. You suggested food, not food. He put forth kind of good xenia versus bad xenia, or cultured and non-cultured. And a number of students added to this with oppositions such as self and other, or determinism versus fatalism. Again, more cultured, not cultured, sighted versus blind from Mark Jablonski, man or not man from Ben Knob, individual versus society from Laura Durham, wild versus well-bred, or order versus chaos from Dale Larder, and a longer number of posts on hubris versus humbleness started by Thomas Kuhn. Now, a lot of these seem to point towards very important themes that run throughout the Odyssey. Some of them we might label oppositions, perhaps more than structuralist binaries. But I was wondering if, you could kind of run through again how you came to food, not food as your idea of the core binary in books 9 through 12, and whether you could offer or suggest either if you considered any of these other kinds of oppositions, or if you've seen another opposition that you think really works well either for a chunk of this epic or for the entirety.
Well, that's a really rich series of suggestions that came up, and we've been following those points on the discussion board. It's interesting, Kat, that the number of proposed binaries grows and grows and grows, and I think that's a great first start. Proposing a binary opposition as a possible one in a structuralist reading is the first thing that you need to do. Then from there you need to develop it. So the idea of developing what binary a person proposes means digging into the details of what the epic, the myth is all about, and trying to take down little pieces of it and line it all up and suggest that this structuralist binary actually does explain the myth as a whole. You need to go through that next step to start to get to the stage of evaluating whether the binary you're proposing actually works. There's lots of stuff a person can suggest as a good binary, and the suggestions might ring true for on first glance. It comes down to this, as you all know from writing your papers, it comes down to the details and actually trying to work it out where a person can try to prove that a particular binary actually explains the myth. Now, the proof shows up, as we explained in our video segment treating this. A person should, this is one way of thinking about it, take the myth. The myth is whatever piece of it you're taking, dip it into liquid nitrogen, freeze it, and then toss it up against a wall, and when it breaks apart, those little pieces you should start to line up. If you can line them all up, the two categories that you propose are broad enough and engaged enough that they can serve as baskets into which all of the epic can be tossed, one into some parts into one, another part into another, then you know you're onto something. At that point, you press even farther and say, how does this binary help explain the epic? How do we know more about the epic when we see this than we did before we did? And all of that takes time and spade work and work on the text and all the digging that is required to start measuring these binaries. And the contrast between a structuralist binary on the one hand and just what's straightforwardly in opposition on the other, that's a good thing to recognize too. Structuralists claim not just that there's some, say, artistic binary, that this artist really likes the imagery of light and darkness on one hand and on the other. A structuralist needs to say, no, there's some elemental piece of what it is to be human, oftentimes biologically inflected. Usually, some piece of this is biologically inflected often. It doesn't absolutely have to be, but it often is. You get some piece of that involved, and then a structuralist starts to take interest, and then we start to say which pieces of the epic line up on one side, which on the other. Sorry, I keep substituting epic for myth. That's not going to count for in a few more weeks. We're going to be into other genres. But which, as long, and if all the stuff lines up, you know you're onto something, and you keep pressing. So it takes a lot of work. It's a lot of spade work and a lot of text work to make this stuff work right. In terms of coming up with the food not food binary, that was just one that showed up for me. Having taught it a lot of times, I started to notice, food was a big thing. Why is it that book 12 is so important? The way that book 12 unfolds, you just think, well, these poor guys, they just ate these cows. What's the big problem? Well, it's a terrible problem, and how terrible the problem is, I think, only comes to the surface once you realize, or if I'm right in suggesting that binary, and it might not be right, it's my claim, that helps to give explanations for how lots of pieces of this myth fit together. The more pieces of the myth that have explanations because of your proposed binary, the better that binary is going to be. So that's a long answer.
Yeah, but thank you very much for
Okay.
clarifying.
Worth.
I look forward to seeing what they came up with in their essays.
Me too, yeah. Where are we going next?
I think I have another question.
Okay.
And this kind of has to do with a more specific example that we've been discussing this week in some of our lectures, how some have proposed that book 24 might be a later interpolation. And we have this other idea that perhaps going back to this 9 through 12 set of books, that maybe book 11 is a later interpolation. So a couple of things having to do with that very odd sort of interlude where we meet the characters from the underworld, that what are our views, or what is at stake if we say that this book is a later interpolation or might be a later interpolation. How might that change either our perspective on 9 through 12, the epic as a whole, and what is this place, the underworld, at all? We've said that it's not really under anything, so what are we actually saying about this place?
That's really interesting. Well, a couple of you sort of zeroed in on the discussion board on the fact that Book 11 is odd, and it's out of place. We're journeying to this land that humans, while they're alive, aren't supposed to journey to. I mean, that's sort of part of the definition of being a human. So Aristarchus, who was an ancient commentator, did think that Book 11 was an interpolation, and many follow his lead, both because of the repetitiveness and sort of a little bit of the language, the sorts of catalogs that are embedded, like the Catalog of Women. So it really is an open question as far as interpolation versus not interpolation. So we'll leave that, we'll leave that a little bit open. We don't have to necessarily come down on one side or the other. But this whole question of the underworld is just fascinating. So according to where Odysseus has to travel, it's not that he descends necessarily into the underworld as in a catabasis, so a journey downward. That's normally how we think of the underworld, from other later literature and what have you. But he's actually sailing on a river and journeying to the farthest edges of the known Earth. And in the Homeric world, the Earth was thought to be encircled by the river Ocean. So he's journeying to Ocean, and Ocean is supposed to feed into the rivers of the underworld. So the Styx and Acheron, among others. So what Odysseus actually does is, first of all, he pays due reverence to the dead, to the shades, and to the powers of the underworld by feeding them a libation of milk and honey and wine, sprinkled over with some barley. So this is, sort of, there is a kind of downward inclination in that we know we bury the dead. So somehow the dead are there. But then, interestingly, the shades actually flit up, don't they, to meet him. So all of these shades kind of are drawn by the sacrificial offerings, and this is sort of what we see, going on. So a lot of you were right to press on that point and say, does he literally descend down? Well, he may not. The text leaves it open, and even on the level of the Greek, it can be sort of a downward motion or a kind of beyond. I don't know if others want to weigh in on this idea of what we do in the underworld, what Odysseus is doing.
Maybe dislocation is part of it, actually. If you think of a place where your status in it is a problem, is atypical, that maybe a form of disorientation is a way to express what it would be like. Are things coming at you from under, from out? An instability might be trying to attain to that if the collision of these worlds that don't collide. And I love, thank you for your geography of the oceans. That does remind me of our earlier discussions, both in the course and in chats about the corrupting sea. So you do have that fluid contiguity there.
Well, and this is a place where Odysseus can distinguish himself, even getting that close. He receives explicit instructions that this is the next step on his journey, and he has to go through this very sort of horrific journey in order to proceed and to get home, to receive his homecoming, his nostos.
Yeah, but I think the idea of dislocation is really powerful. There's a huge amount of anxiety surrounding that, right? And we see, I think, one of the figures that really brings out that anxiety is actually Ajax, who doesn't say anything, who doesn't want to talk to Odysseus at all, whether he's still angry over the arms of Achilles or not, or about his kind of displaced honor, his kind of anxieties over his afterlife on Earth, or not, is one side of it. But then we get this phrase that he'd rather live as a slave or live as a servant on Earth. He'd rather be anywhere but this kind of undefined area of the underworld. And
then there's the opposite, sort of, with Elpenor. Remember, we still have unfinished business, and you can't let the dead go unburied. So one of the tasks here is to put poor Elpenor in his rightful place in the underworld, and put him at peace.
Very good. Yeah.
So maybe we can leave the underworld. We've been
leave it
there.
far, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
What something I wanted to discuss with all of you, something that our fabulous students, I feel like we're talking about in lots of different ways, is the ending. So he goes and he receives the message from Tiresias, and he receives the message from Circe, as Aristarchus and you all pointed out. There is some repetition there, and he is able to come home. And in this very last section, the last books, are characterized by a great amount of violence. And I was actually struck, I don't mind having to mention this, you guys I'm sensing much more involvement with the violence in this, and I thought that was really fascinating and interesting. And you guys are great sensitive readers, and it was really interesting to me to see Thomas Kuhn, who spoke about actually being disgusted in book 22, and a lot of people were affected. Tony Fitzgerald spoke about the death of the maids as being a particularly upsetting incident. And even John Hawkes looking at Laertes, who has this final strange killing that he does, his little act of battle. And so all these deaths, and it did seem to affect people a lot. And I think we want to think about a little more about what it means to end this story with these multiple upsetting scenes, whether it's these suitors who we've seen acting poorly, and we've even questioned that, to what extent are they to blame, to what extent is Athena goading them, but then they meet a really grisly end, and the maids meet a very brutal end, and then this other strange man meets a very brutal end. And what do we think is going on with this violence?
The violence that's characteristic of book 22, this spasm of just horrific violence that is disgusting, is actually characteristic of the kind of thing you see in something like the Iliad, Homer's epic of the parts of what the Trojan War are all about. Heroes do commit extreme violence. It's part of what makes them what they are. I want to, when we run into these things, always have reserve two different kinds of reactions for me to have, and I want to protect both. On the one hand, I want to try to understand, in the context of the time, why it is that it made sense to them to talk this way. Why is it that it's perfectly heroic for Odysseus to be so savage and so awful? Why is it perfectly heroic to talk about stringing up these maids in this corporate hanging? Then I also want to reserve another kind of reaction that I want to be able to have, which is, well, from my perspective, irrespective of what the Greeks thought about it, I am disgusted by this. And both of those reactions, I think, are important to protect and to develop and to carefully articulate my views on. So I would say that developing that first view of the context of the time, this is standard hero stuff. And why that is, I can't begin to fathom, except to say that these heroes are not gentle and sweet. That's gentleness and sweetness is not necessarily a heroic quality. It's just not there in the Greek context. It is capability, a capacity to get things done, and taking on this burden of conducting violence is something that they do when it's necessary to do. It's not done lightly, but it is definitely done. And here, getting this done is what falls to Odysseus to do. I think within slightly different reaction within the context of the story, those suitors are really bad. Of course they're going to get it. And the serving women who get it, we're allied with the suitors. We have to look at the gender imbalance that happens then, so it's not as though any deal between a group of males and a group of females is an equal deal where all had an equal say in what happened. But there is built-in pieces of the story that should make us, as witnessers of the story, understand that there's going to be hell to pay for the people that were involved in setting up this imbalanced situation.
Yeah, just to kind of build a little bit on that, I think something that has also been coming up in the forums are kind of these parallels between this set of 9 through 12 and then the ending, that we get kind of a very visceral disgust reaction if we think about cannibalism or things that are very much not food. And what's been coming up in the forums is that we get this same reaction with kind of this excessive idea of violence. Are these ideas of the Cyclops' perversion of Xenia or Odysseus' perversion of Xenia paralleled with the suitors and Odysseus at the end, which is worse? the Cyclops as accountable or Odysseus's murder of all the suitors. And one thing I would offer is that, whereas the Cyclops calls down a curse on Odysseus, Odysseus is, at the end of the epic, is very concerned with purification. So even though all of the slaughter has happened, he is still kind of trying to get back to that clean slate, right, a tabula rasa, and start over again. Whereas in 9 through 12, you don't have that image. But I'm wondering if you have any other ideas about that parallel, I guess.
Yeah, I do, and I appreciate that question. The reaction of disgust, I tried to develop this in my lecture. I'm fascinated by it. My teaching team knows that. Disgust is fascinating to me. It parades itself in front of us as if it's utterly natural, because you and I can't negotiate with it. It just happens. We feel disgusted. However, the things that provoke a disgust response vary from culture to culture to culture. So unless I'm somehow special in the universe, I think that's probably not true, then my disgust responses must also be culturally determined. So I would claim that, at least, to some extent, culturally determined. It's not a pure natural reaction. So I would claim that in Homer's version, it's likely that the moments when disgust is invoked are not going to line up with necessarily the moments when disgust is provoked for me. And reading the story, if I feel disgusted by what Odysseus does, disgusted in the way I would feel disgusted about an animal eating a human being or a monster eating a human being, I would want to reserve those two layers of reaction, my own, which is to say, sure, I find this disgusting, and here's why. People shouldn't go off in orgies of spasmodic violence and kill people in insane ways. Then I have to, and that disgusts me, then I have to realize that in Homer's context, it's hard to see that Homer gives us cues that he's disgusted by what happens in Book 22. I don't think he is. Now, if someone wants to put together some textual evidence, put it up on the discussion forum, let's have a longer conversation about it. But I don't find evidence in the text that Homer is disgusted by what happens. That's just, they're trying to, they're getting what they're going to get. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the culture in which that makes sense? And that's the second part, always, of reacting to these nasty pieces in Homer. So.
Just one little side note, speaking of specifically women against violence, there is one other place where we see a hanging death of a woman in the Odyssey, and that is actually in Book 11. Going back to Book 11, we thought we'd left the underworld, but we haven't quite yet. And that is in the Parade of Women, Epicasta. We'll know her better as Jocasta. You'll meet her in the Oedipus that we'll be reading shortly. But here, significantly, it is also for a sexual crime of incest, but she hangs herself. In the Odyssey, she commits suicide. So there is, on one interpretation, a value judgment that these women didn't actually, punish themselves for the crimes of disloyalty that they committed. They had to be strung up all together, all alike, all in a row, by the men of the household. So that is one interpretation. That's not the only one, but it is just something to note.
Something I just had to share with everyone here. This isn't the most recent. Hello, Condé Nast. Little plug for you here. This is the October 15th New Yorker. I was really delighted to find there's a poem in it by the poet Tony Hoagland called "The Hero's Journey." And I thought it was such wonderful timing because it investigates what Hoagland calls a lot of secondary characters in the titular hero's journey. And I thought this was so perfect. In the end, it ends with Odysseus in a nursing home. So those of you who, a very tender scene of Odysseus being taken care of in his nursing home. So not quite the heroic end we see him having. But it does call attention to these secondary characters. And I know from the forums and from our discussion, there has been some, and from the reading we've been doing, we're seeing these different types of characters, particularly at the end of the epic, especially for those who see this as all being these regal audiences and regal characters. Now we've got Eumaeus. I know this was something we had in lecture, but there were still some questions about why he is addressed in the second person, and also Eurycleia at a certain moment get the second person pronoun. It really leaps off the page. I know in some cases there are metrical concerns, but I think, as Professor Struck said in the lecture, there's an interesting relationship that unfolds with these characters and the support they give and the roles they play in the way the end of the epic all comes together. They take on their roles here, and I think if you're interested, I think the Hoagland poem is a nice moment of continued relevance for this epic, for these characters, and also a very modern take on calling out these secondary characters for having that importance that we might see just glancingly in those moments of address of you. So I just couldn't resist.
Well,
are we to one last? I had a question about blindness that came up from Anhiti Patnaik. And Anhiti writes in, when Odysseus blinds Polyphemus, he divests him of a crucial sensory tool to know his path before he walks it. From here on, Polyphemus will have to stumble. She makes a comparison between what happens there and the curse that's brought down on Odysseus by Poseidon, so that now Odysseus, in a blind way, is going to have to stumble in his next layers of his journey. It was a very nice metaphorical connection that's drawn, and I wondered if there was any reaction that you all had to that suggestion.
Well, I really like the idea of blindness as kind of a metaphor for a specific type of knowledge, right? So we've kind of seen how Odysseus has a type of knowledge that allows him to be very clever, right? He's polytropos, etc. So he has this kind of ability to fend for himself and to kind of find his way in one sense. But then he has this blindness in that he doesn't know exactly where he's going. He has this insatiable desire for another kind of knowledge that first he seeks from Circe. He seeks from the sirens who have the knowledge of all things that will happen to him. So he has one type of cleverness, but he doesn't have this other type of knowledge or really an understanding of, I think, every aspect of the peoples and the monsters that he meets on his journey. We're going to see this very shortly, I think, when we start reading tragedy, that there's a very large difference between the cleverness or the kind of knowledge that allows one to solve riddles or solve puzzles versus the knowledge that is really understanding. It's kind of for me, I would say it's a difference between, blindness versus sight, or one type of sight versus real insight, right? So Tiresias, the blind prophet, has this insight. I wonder if Polyphemus gained any sort of insight after his blinding, but I will leave that for...
We will meet him again.
We will meet him again.
I'm giving us a spoiler here, but...
Right.
But I kind of wonder how we develop if that sense is taken away.
Yeah. I think a different kind of sight is possible if that goes away. Tiresias being blind. There are, of course, traditions that Homer was blind. We don't know anything about Homer, but there are some that will swear that he was. So that comes, I think, linked into this same question about insight is possible after that kind of sight is taken away. Other things? Further thoughts? Shall we close up our Screenside Chat?
Sure. Keep those forum posts coming. We enjoy reading them all.
It's good to talk to you this way, and keep talking to us on the discussion forums. It's really helping us understand what's on your mind. And best of luck with the peer assessments. We're looking forward to what the results are going to be there. And thanks so much for your continued work in the course. Also, just as a footnote, I think you'll find from here on that the reading load every week is diminished a bit. That reading the Odyssey, we have to get through that quickly, so there's a lot of pages per week. Some of the other reading is challenging in a different way, but we usually don't have page counts that are quite like that. So if you've made it this far, chances are you're going to make it. Good luck with the rest of it all, and see you all again.
All right. Good luck, everyone.